Let me just begin by saying what an honor it is to be here with you this afternoon. It's a tremendous honor for me to be in the company of so many people that I respect so much. But let's begin with some good news. For the past 3 years, I've been traveling around the world to some of the least free countries in order to write this book. And it just so happened, it wasn't necessarily that I was being prophetic or anything, but along the way, some good things happened. It's become much harder to be a dictator these days. It's just downright not easy. You may remember some of these faces. They're not smiling anymore. Now, in fact, it's never been harder, in my opinion, to be a dictator than it is today. Because not long ago, an autocrat could use some of the most blunt weapons in order to cow or control his population. We think of Stalin's gulags. We think of Mao's revolutionary campaigns, Pol Pot's killing fields. Well, today, dictators have more forces arrayed against them than ever before. 20 years ago, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, many lost their chief sponsor. With that, almost overnight, the democracy promotion business became a cottage industry. So that now, today, human rights activists, election monitors, citizens are able to shine a spotlight on these regimes' worst abuses. They're able to flood the zone, if you will, of conflict and bring us back stories that before would have gone untold. In 1989, as the Chinese Communist Party prepared to declare martial law, it took one other step, which is that it pulled the plug. It literally pulled the plug on CNN's broadcast. The screen went dark. Well, that would be a meaningless act today, because the regime is well aware that if there were another violent crackdown, if the people were to assemble once again in Tiananmen Square, and there were another violent crackdown, it would be captured by 1,000 iPhones and broadcast around the world in real time. Bashar Assad, 18 months ago, banned foreign reporters from Syria. No matter. At no point during this conflict have we lacked information about what was happening inside that country. It's a very different world from the one that his father lived in when in 1982, in the space of a month, killed tens of thousands of Syrians in crushing an uprising there. We don't actually know how many people died. The low estimates are 25,000. Some estimates go as high as 40. But the thing that's different is that in 1983 and 1984, Syria was much like it had been before. It was able to return to the international community. Bashar Assad may hang on for 6 weeks, 6 months, or years. I don't know. But we can confidently say that he's not returning to a regime that will be what it was before. He lives in a different world. And indeed, if there's any evidence of how much harder it is to practice their craft, it's just that there's so much fewer of them. I mean, in 1974, there were 41 democracies in the world. By 1991, that number had climbed to 76. By 2005, there were more than 120. But if Tiananmen Square was to happen today, it would be a completely, utterly different situation, because the regime knows that if the people assemble, and members of the Chinese Communist Party told me this, if the people assemble, we don't know if we can survive. Because after 2005, the world changed in a way, in a sense, went backwards in time, in that we have seen from that period of time, from 2005 to now, a decline in political freedom for 6 consecutive years, the longest decline in nearly 40 years. Now, in 2010, the number of democracies in the world was at the lowest point since 1995. And some of our biggest success stories, Ukraine, Georgia, and elsewhere, began to unravel. So what changed? The problem doesn't rest with democracy. As if we learned nothing in 2011, we learned that people still yearn to be free, and in fact are willing to take enormous chances for that freedom. What has changed is the nature of dictatorship. Today's dictators are more sophisticated, savvy, and nimble than their predecessors. Today's modern dictator understands that facing these growing pressures that I listed before, facing those pressures, that they had a choice. And the choice was not to harden their regimes into police states, no, and it wasn't to cut themselves off from the world. It was to learn and adapt. And that's what the smartest among them have done. Modern dictators have honed new techniques, strategies, and formulas for preserving power. In a sense, refashioning dictatorship for the modern age. So what does that mean? That means that in a globalized context, these regimes and others understand that the most brutal forms of intimidation are best to give way to more subtle forms of coercion. So that today, if Vladimir Putin wishes for a human rights organization to be shuttered, it's much more likely that that organization will be visited by a tax inspector, by a health inspector. And they'll look at their paperwork. They'll find that their paperwork is not in order, and they will then be closed. NGOs are closed for fire code violations. Now, it may seem mundane, but it's a legalized process, so to speak, and you may appeal. We'll see how that goes. In Venezuela, laws are written broadly, but then applied like a scalpel against those that the regime deems a threat. So as one activist in Venezuela told me, Chavez's motto should be something along the lines of, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law. These regimes frequently have control of the media, but not total control. They don't want total control. They will allow for calculated exceptions, usually small print publications that have no chance of really reaching a broader audience, but does serve a purpose. It serves a purpose and it allows a way for the people, like a safety valve, to vent. It also provides useful information for the regime itself, because a problem common to these regimes is having accurate information. So that you see it in China today, to the degree that there has been an opening of media space, it's been in financial journalism, because the regime knows that the party is corrupt, but it needs to know who's egregiously corrupt. And a few journalists who are able to practice their craft somewhat freely is one of the best ways that they can find out. These regimes are fluent in the language of human rights. They are fluent in the language of democracy. And indeed, ultimately, also, even, as you know, hold elections. But this is different. These aren't the sham elections of the Soviet Union, whereby Brezhnev walks away with 99% of the vote. No, these are, because they recognize there's no value in winning with 99% of the vote. It's clearly a charade. Why participate in the charade? Why even take the risk? Rather, the only election that's worth stealing is one that appears to be contested. So they win with 70%. 70% is the new 99. Now, to be clear, it's not as though there aren't some old school retrograde dictatorships that have somehow managed to limp into the 21st century. There are. There are the North Koreas, the Turkmenistans, and until recently, one might have said the Burmas of the world. But they represent dictatorships past. No one wants to be the next North Korea. Now, that's a part of the equation. It's not the most hopeful part. But there's another side, which is that if it's the case that these regimes have become more nimble, it is also true that the people challenging them have become much more nimble too. Now, you can be forgiven for believing that some of the events we've witnessed recently, or even going back further in time, felt somehow spontaneous. The narrative that you're often presented is one of as if 100,000 or tens of thousands of people all of a sudden on one day came to the same conclusion that they could no longer stomach living in the system that they'd been living in for so long. But the reality is that few revolutions, few uprisings are really nearly as spontaneous as they appear. As one activist put it to me, spontaneity does nothing but get you killed. Because what we don't do a very good job of doing, and when I say we, I mean people like me, is we don't do a great job of telling you the story of how that happens, because we're not paying attention during the years when these groups are learning their most valuable lessons. A big purpose of writing the book for me, in that half of the book is looking at the people who are challenging these regimes, is telling that story of how these people came to understand the tactics and learn themselves how best to confront these regimes. We need to pay attention when they are learning how to mobilize a movement. We're not watching when they're learning how to chip away at a regime's legitimacy. We're not watching when they are learning how to craft a political message. Because there's a temptation to write them off. I mean, this was certainly the case in Egypt, where many of the very respected and excellent scholars of Egypt didn't take the youth seriously because it was just seemed to be a pattern of failure. What they weren't recognizing is that there was experimentation, that it was trial and error, but not mindless trial and error. And if we don't understand that, I think that we're then in danger of really missing one of the central lessons of our time, which is that the struggle between democracy and dictatorship today is rarely, almost never, a conflict between nations. It's a contest between people. And so 3 years ago, I began by trying to go out to actually witness the struggle firsthand. And so I traveled to Russia, Egypt, Venezuela, Malaysia, China, and elsewhere. And in each place, I would meet with two groups of people. I would meet with the people who served the regime. I would meet with the political ideologues, the advisors, the military, the cronies, the opportunists. And I would meet with the people on the other side of the equation, the people who were trying to topple the regime, the environmentalists, the bloggers, the students, the academics, the lawyers, the everyday citizens who, like some of our speakers earlier, have found themselves on the front lines. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't something that they necessarily knew would happen, but they found their voice and they find themselves now in a position where they are now actively pushing for change. And what happened for me, at least as I went through this process as I became much more optimistic than I was when I initially began. And the reason was that again and again, the people that I was meeting, they weren't romantics. There's not much room or time for romantics in this struggle. They don't last very long. The people that I was meeting were battle-hardened tacticians, people who were incredibly pragmatic and steeled by their experience. And what happens when you spend enough time with many of these people is you begin to see unexpected networks of people and organizations that are springing up to tilt the scales, if you will. So I'll tell you, by way of closing, I'll tell you about one. If you don't know him already, meet Srđa Popović. Srđa was one of the student leaders who led the student movement in Serbia in 2000 that toppled Slobodan Milosevic. Afterwards, like many of the student leaders, he went into politics. He didn't much care for it. Maybe after the heady days of toppling a dictator, arguing about zoning regulations wasn't that interesting. But not long after, he began to notice that he was being called by other youth groups to tell them about how they accomplished what they did in Serbia because they wanted to accomplish the same. And he had an epiphany while meeting with Zimbabweans that this was actually his life's work. And so he established, along with some other friends, Canvas, the Center for Applied Nonviolent Strategies. And in the last 9 years, they've trained democratic activists in over 50 countries. What does that mean? Well, a year ago, I had the opportunity to watch them train a group. There were ground rules. First, I'm not allowed to say where the training happened, not the country where the people came from, where the activists were from, or who the trainers were. But on a Mediterranean island, I met with Serbians who were training Middle Eastern activists on how to bring change to their country. And the learning process was an incredible thing because they were not just learning the macro strategy of how to pull the pillars out from under the regime, but they were also learning tactical lessons. And never have all your leaders be in one place. There were 11 leaders in the Serbian movement. They never were in the same room. Gather intelligence by meeting with your with your family, your grandparents. They were part of a system that understood how the police worked. There was incredible networks where they could gather information about how the regime worked. And then there was a question that always came up, and it came up in all the countries that I visited. What do you do about the most brutal police officials who don't beat young people necessarily just because they're being ordered to, but because they actually enjoy it? And this came up during our conversations during one of those days. And they said, look, this is what we did in Serbia. In Serbia, we took a photograph of a person like that, and we made a poster. And on that poster, we showed them beating a young person, and we put their name and their cell phone number. And then underneath we said, why do you beat our children? Call him and ask. And then they took those posters and they plastered them up on the walls where his wife shopped. They plastered them up on the walls on the route where he would walk his children to school. They plastered them on the walls of where his mother lives. They could not confront him through the badge. On the badge, he was an anonymous official, but through the community, through his family, they could make him put down the baton. They could change his behavior. And so it was the case that they learned lessons like this and many more. And after several days, they left and went back home. And a few weeks later, there were massive protests and demonstrations in their country, the largest in a generation. And it's for reasons like that I believe that in this fight, the dictator cannot learn quickly enough. Thank you very much.